Okay.
Welcome, Chair Dean.
Okay, thank you. Mayor Patterson, members of the council, Donald Dean, Chair of the Planning Commission, thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. I know this is an important project for everybody. It's been going on for a long time. In the case of the Commission for 3 years, so I just want to give you a little background, kind of our thinking over the last few years, and probably that will be, we haven't had a chance to debrief fully since the vote that we took on this to not to certify the EIR and to deny the planning or the land use permit. So some of it will be filtered through my experience being chair and what I was thinking through this whole process, and then adding in how I saw the rest of the commission, their comments and their discussion over this whole period of time. So to start, there's really, it has been mentioned before, you're hearing this item de novo so that you can look at the entire process and not just the findings and the tail end of the process, which is mentioned so prominently in the appeal. And I think that's a very good idea because the findings are just the very last part of the process, and this has been a long process through a number of environmental documents with a lot of public testimony. So really, to go to the heart of this project, there's really three things to consider. The first is the EIR, the second is the land use permit, and the third is this whole issue of federal preemption, and I'd like to address those one at a time. So in terms of the EIR, just so that you remember the flow of this whole process, the city issued a mitigated negative declaration in May of 2013, and in there they said that there's no significant impacts that can't be mitigated, so essentially no very serious impacts. There was really a lot of controversy about that. The city went back and said, okay, we'll do a draft EIR. A draft EIR came out about a year later, and in the draft EIR there were impacts related to the project, but all those project impacts could be mitigated, so again, there was no significant and unavoidable impacts. And following that draft EIR, there's really a blizzard of public comment, not just from concerned neighbors, but also some public agencies. And because the draft EIR, although it identified impacts, but no significant unavoidable impacts, and as a result of that comment, the city was forced to go through another round of environmental review, which was the revised draft EIR. So just so that you understand kind of the breadth of the comments on the first draft EIR, not only did we get comments from the community and from individuals and from groups, but from a lot of public agencies, and just to name a few: Yolo County, City of Davis, Sacramento Air Quality Management District, SACOG, which is the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, Bay Area Air Quality Management District, Yolo Solano Air Quality Management District, and last but not least, California Attorney General's Office. So the gist of those comments was that the EIR analysis of the project impacts needed to go beyond the boundary of the refinery and actually beyond Benicia. For instance, the letter from the State Attorney General listed a whole variety of issues, and just to give you a sense of the breadth of the comments, those issues included hazardous materials release, air emissions, geographic scope of the analysis, cumulative impacts related to crude by rail transportation, and definition of trade secret. So that was just one letter. So the city did a revised draft EIR, recirculated that. That came out in August of 2015. That identified new impacts, and not just impacts that could be mitigated, but a series of significant and unavoidable impacts based on the fact that these impacts could not be mitigated. Those included air quality, greenhouse gases, biology, and significant hazards to the public. And I would say probably the one that got the most attention and most disturbing was a significant hazard to the public, which were due to the transportation of crude oil by rail. The analysis stated that the risk was relatively low. If there were to be an accident along the rail corridor, the results could be catastrophic. That risk cannot be mitigated. And then there was another wave of comments, many from the same agencies, raising the same issues as before on that revised draft EIR. So if you sense a trend here, is that for each new and more rigorous round of environmental review, the evaluations revealed more issues, not fewer issues, and the issues related to the project appear to be getting more severe, not less severe. So then we come to the final EIR, which was just published this past January, a couple of months ago. And normally a final EIR is supposed to respond to and resolve the questions on the earlier draft documents. However, there were substantial comments on the final EIR, and many of the issues were the same that had been raised in letters on the previous draft documents. Mitigation, and just to tell you what some of those were, some of the more important ones. Issues were available, mitigation measures were available for significant rail-related impacts, and those should be identified. Analysis needs to include those mitigation measures. In other words, the EIR analysis needed to include those mitigation measures. And the city's interpretation of federal preemption was too broad. Also, there were many comments that said the final EIR didn't respond to comments, that it was too dismissive of many of the comments and many of the letters. So the Commission was receiving letters on the final EIR from the public right up to the final night of the hearings, and letters were not just coming from concerned neighbors or environmental groups, groups that you may expect would oppose the project, but from public agencies. And these public agencies with professional staffs, that you would not be prone to going out on a limb to oppose a project without ample justification. Just to give you an example, we had the planning manager from the Solano-Yolo Air District who spoke on the third night of the meetings. And I have to say, working in the public sector for probably 30 years, there's not many times when you see a staff member who will show up for a night meeting to comment on a project, and he commented in opposition to the project, let alone sit through a number of night meetings in order to make his comment. So clearly the public agencies, and these are our public agencies, the ones that we're looking to protect our best interests, thought that there was something fundamentally amiss with our process. So how does the Commission determine the adequacy of the EIR? There are a number of significant unavoidable impacts, and for rail impacts, the EIR didn't identify mitigation measures due to the preemption issues which you've heard so much about tonight, stating that federal law prevents this, and yet federal preemption seems subject to debate. The issue of federal preemption aside, many of the commissioners still had questions about the adequacy of the EIR document. Would the project actually reduce the greenhouse gases to the degree that was discussed? Was the traffic analysis adequate? What about maintaining access to existing businesses and first responders? What were the risks to first responders? What about the site design? Was the loading platform too close to the creek? What about the potential for cars to topple into the creek? What about the platform's location in the 100-year floodplain? How would sea level rise play into that? What about accident liability? Who would pay to clean up spills? Would insurance or Union Pacific Railroad self-insurance be adequate? Were the estimates of economic benefits realistic? So those are just a few of the topics. There were others we discussed also, but those are the ones that come to mind from the last night of the meeting, or the last couple of nights of the meeting. There's also the discussion of alternatives, that they seem too limited. No changes to the size or configuration of the loading platform were considered. 2 of the 3 listed alternatives were infeasible due to railroad preemption, and the third would need a separate environmental analysis if you wanted to look at that with any seriousness. That just didn't seem adequate for a project of this importance. Then the other next topic I wanted to talk to is the issue of federal preemption. I know you've heard a lot about that already. Federal preemption certainly played a central role to this whole discussion. And as you've heard, the federal government regulates the railroads and no one else does. No one on the Planning Commission took issue with this. It makes sense that the railroads are regulated by the government and not by every little jurisdiction along the tracks. But the question was, how broad does the preemption go? The city staff's position is that the preemption is broad and removes consideration of any railroad-related impacts from the discussion, even though they appear to be the most serious impacts that we had to deal with. There's plenty of contradictory testimony about the preemption. We heard from attorneys from environmental groups who you might expect to oppose the project, but there are also letters from regional agencies like SACOG and the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, who repeatedly said that federal preemption was not as broad as the city was interpreting it. We should be considering some of the railroad impacts and mitigating those with measures that don't affect railroad operations. Just to give you a couple of examples of what they talked about in their letters, one was mitigating air emissions from trains by buying pollution credits. That doesn't affect railroad operations in any way. A second example would be making dollar contributions to provide increased training and equipment for first responders in case of an accident. That doesn't appear to affect railroad operations in any way. Those types of mitigations were not something that the EIR considered or evaluated, although it was mentioned numerous times in agency letters and comments on both the draft EIR and the revised draft EIR. To compound matters, the Crude by Rail project is going through a similar approval process in San Luis Obispo County that was referred to earlier by Mr. Hogan. The facts of the San Luis Obispo case were not exactly the same as the Valero case. Nobody has said that they are, but I think the important point is that the county staff in San Luis Obispo took a much different and I would say more narrow interpretation of the preemption doctrine. So in the San Luis Obispo approach, they said that because preemption prevented any mitigation measure for rail-related impacts, that wasn't a reason to consider the railroad-related impacts significant and a reason to deny the project. To make a long story short, there was considerable disagreement about how broadly to interpret the preemption doctrine. As I recall one of the commissioners saying during the meetings, the issue of preemption as it relates to Valero project is murky at best. Speaking for myself, I wasn't aware of the full extent of the federal preemptions until very late in the process, and it wasn't until I read the staff report going into the final round of meetings that it was apparent that the city's interpretation of preemption would limit the commission to consider what it could consider when it came time to make the findings on the land use permit. So finally, one more quick preemption issue, more esoteric, related to making CEQA findings, and again, this was referred to earlier tonight, making CEQA findings in the Statement of Overriding Considerations. In order to approve a project, the Commission must adopt a statement that the benefits of the project outweigh any significant and unavoidable impacts. We were advised by staff that we couldn't consider the significant rail-related impacts in making CEQA findings, but that seemed contradictory to the public disclosure intent of California's environmental law. Because the Commission didn't approve the project, it didn't have to deal with this issue. However, this is an issue that Council would have to consider if you do choose to approve the project. So, the last of the three things I wanted to talk about was the land use permit. That's the most fundamental task that the Planning Commission has, and that's to regulate land use. The Commission is required to make findings as part of any land use permit. So there's three findings that the Commission has to make, but the second one is most pertinent. And that reads, and I'm just going to read it to you from the Benicia City Code. It says the proposed location of the conditional use and the proposed conditions under which it will be operated or maintained would be consistent with the general plan. It will not be detrimental to the public health, safety, or welfare of persons residing or working in or adjacent to the neighborhood of the use, nor detrimental to the properties or improvements in the vicinity or to the general welfare of the city. So staff's position is that the Commission could not consider the rail-related impacts when making those findings, only the on-site, meaning the non-rail impacts. I didn't think, and I said so at the time, that I personally could make the determination that the project would not be detrimental to the public health, safety, or welfare of the community. For me, the definition of the community goes beyond the boundaries of the city. I felt that given the many questions over the federal preemption, I couldn't dismiss the potential crude by rail impact to Benicia, the industrial park, the people who work in the industrial park, and the upper rail communities. Evidently, the rest of the Commission felt the same way, or at least I hope they did. And then, the Commission also needed to make findings related to the general plan. However, the project seemed inconsistent with a number of general plan policies. I'm just going to read you a couple here that I think are relevant. The first is Goal 2.5, facilitate and encourage new uses and development which provide substantial and sustainable fiscal and economic benefits to the city and to the community while providing health, safety, and quality of life. Goal 2.6, attract and retain a balance of different kinds of industrial uses to Benicia. Goal 4.1, make community health and safety a high priority for Benicia. Goal 4.7, ensure that existing and future neighborhoods are safe from risks in public health that could result from exposure to hazardous materials. Goal 4.10, support improved regional air quality. That goes directly to the letters from the different air districts that we received on the draft, EIR documents. So the Commission has a conundrum. We have a project that has significant unavoidable impacts, some potentially life-threatening, and a project not consistent with general plan policies, and we're being asked to make a finding that it won't be detrimental to the health, safety, and welfare of the city. That's a finding that I don't think we could make in good conscience. In addition, one of the commissioners reminded us that the use permit runs with the land, not with the application. That means that the use permit would also go to the next owner of the refinery, if there ever is one, who may not be so safety conscious as Valero. So for practical purposes, the land use permit is permanent and can't be rescinded. Given all that, the doubts about the EIR, the questions about the preemption, and the significance of the impacts, the Commission felt it couldn't certify the EIR and couldn't approve the land use permit. It's been a long process for the Commission, so I hope the Council will benefit from our, I think, hard work and many hours of testimony, and I hope that your learning curve is a little faster than ours. So that concludes my report. Thank you for your attention.